agenda in terms of directly emissions. Madam Vice Chair, I'd like to move that we add the stakeholder meetings for the general permit to the agenda. Yes, okay, thank you. That was an agenda, addition to the agenda, I think. We accept the agenda as amended. Thank you very much. So, for old business, we have two sets of, minutes, one from the February 2023 meeting, and let's just address that one first. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Hearing none, yeah, see the motion for the acceptance of minutes, please.
Madam Vice Chair, I move that we accept the minutes as presented to us.
Those are probably the second. All in favor, let me know by saying aye. Okay, so the second item is the agenda for the minutes from March 2023. You've had them already, corrections or additions? Hearing none, I have a discussion, motion for acceptance. So good. Second. March 2023 meeting. All in favor, let me know. Thank you very much. So now we will go over to business. And I would like to welcome DEQ Deputy Secretary Tim Watkins to give some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? So, good afternoon. On behalf of Secretary Biden, I want to thank everybody for being here today. She sends her regrets of not being able to join us. I also want to thank the city for hosting us here today. I've had the opportunity to sit in on a couple of the board meetings at Green Square, but never had the opportunity to make opening remarks. So I appreciate that. And with that, I thought I'd do a brief introduction of myself. Started with Chief Deputy Secretary last year, so it's coming up on 1 year in this appointment. Previously to that, I worked with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 32 years. The last 22 years, primarily with the Office of Research and Development in RPP, where I had the opportunity to work closely with Dr. Lundell on several different activities. We had several different positions in there, but of interest perhaps to this group of my most recent position before coming to DEQ was the National Program Director for Sustainable Health and Community Research Program. I was able to, in that role, I was able to get a lot to learn, but I learned a lot about environmental justice and issues such as cumulative impacts. And so, moving transition to this role, I see this board as a key piece of helping us be able to address these issues front and in our state. So now I'd like to make a few remarks about the agenda today. First, as everybody knows, addressing PFAS contamination in our state is a top priority for DEQ. North Carolina, and particularly the communities in the Cape Fear River Basin, have really been at the forefront of this issue, not in our state and really nationally, as we think about PFAS, primarily because of the discovery of the contamination of Cape Fear River from GenX from the Chemo facility back in 2017. Since then, DEQ has taken strong actions to stop the discharge of PFAS from wastewater from the plant's operations, and it also worked to drastically reduce air emissions. QMORS has also been required to test thousands of private drinking water wells and provide replacement water for those residents whose wells have been contaminated. So today we'll get an update on that Michael Scott, who's a director of Division of Waste Management, especially as it relates to efforts in Sampson, Bladen, Cumberland, and Burleson counties. Another important topic we'll be hearing about today is a transition to clean transportation within our state in support of Governor Cooper's efforts to meet our climate. And so we'll be talking about the transition to clean transportation in support of Governor Cooper's efforts to meet our climate goals as well as to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across our state, particularly from the transportation sector. Towards that end, you'll be hearing from Paula Hemmer from our Department of Transportation, talking about the recently released clean transportation plan for our state. And you'll also be hearing from Maya Hoon, who you met today, I think, on the tour, our new Middle Six and DJ coordinator in DEQ. And she'll be talking about proposed environmental justice analysis as relates to the advanced clean trucks rule, which is a rule that would require or would support the transition to electrification of moving heavy duty vehicles in our state. I'm also interested to hear about the follow-up conversation on Kimberly impacts. So with that, you got a full agenda today, so I'll turn it back to Dr. Jonathan Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Martin. Overview of what we are for today. At this time, I would like to invite Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management, to discuss well water sampling PFAS.
Thank you, Vice Chair Johnson, members of the board. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management within the Department of Environmental Quality. We got some slides. Do we want to bring the TV around so the board can see, or?
They should have their slides in front of them. And Michael, can you make sure to speak directly into the microphone, please?
Great, thank you. So today we're going to provide an update on PFAS, or the acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, man-made compounds, we call them, and as Tim, our Chief Deputy, mentioned, there is active well sampling occurring in this county, Sampson County, Bladen, Cumberland, Robeson, and also some lower Cape Fear work that we'll touch on today. So on slide 2, we want to cover this afternoon some specifics about PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and the specific compound GenX, which you may have heard a lot about in the media, comes from one plant, the Moore's plant in Bladen County, North Carolina. We'll talk about the ongoing groundwater sampling across 8 counties in North Carolina related to this plant. Talk about alternate water options when we find these compounds. What are the next steps to really protect residents? Some ongoing work with the state's Bernard Allen program, which is within DEQ, and the resources that it has, and touch on some additional information. Slide 2. So on the slide titled Emerging Compounds, GenX and PFAS, I won't go over all the specifics, but we do want to touch on this compound GenX that comes from the Bladen County Moore's plant. You may hear it referred to as HFPO, dimer acid, or C3 dimer acid. It's technically a trade name for a man-made, virtually unregulated chemical and used in the manufacturing of nonstick coatings and for other purposes. It technically was a replacement for an older PFAS compound, PFOA. When it comes to this particular compound, the critical point for the board to understand is, unfortunately, it's entered the environment and the Cape Fear River upwards of 30 years from the Bladen County plant, which has then impacted other counties downstream. And until the past few years, labs couldn't measure these very low. You'll hear the units part per trillion or nanograms per liter. It could be just drops in a swimming pool, how low these levels are. When it comes to the family of emerging compounds, GenX is a compound within that family. PFAS are part of the emerging compound family. There's often no or specific limits in environmental regulations. There may be little known how they behave in the environment. Do they go deep into our groundwater or only stay in our soil? And then even more so, how they impact the human body. What's the actual health effect? Is there a cancer effect or an immune system effect? Very little is known. There's a lot of active work at the federal EPA level as well as DEQ, with EPA setting interim and final health goals where there's enough health data available for several PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, Gen X that we've already talked about this afternoon, and PFBs. And they are a definite challenge for regulatory. Next slide provides a brief timeline. This particular timeline is important because as we touched on, Gen X and some other PFAS entered North Carolina's environment from the Bladen County Chemours plant way before 2017. But a lot of the focus that year was on the Cape Fear River. Shortly thereafter, it was discovered, and I'll show you some additional slides, that groundwater was impacted from these compounds. And a lot of North Carolinians depend on groundwater as their drinking water source. Not everybody's on a water line or has a tap or a water bill. They have a private well and depend on groundwater as their drinking water source. You'll see through the timeline, we'll talk a little more about this, that air emissions were identified as one of the main contributing factors. These compounds were actually coming out to stack emissions. There was testing of those emissions, a significant update in 2019 with the development of that court order, Bladen County Superior Court consent order, that really governs a lot of this work moving forward, including the private well sampling work we'll talk about today. Also, the components related to controlling the air emissions with the thermal oxidizer being installed and ongoing private well work and work in the lower Cape Fear region. So if we go to the next slide, it gives you an illustration of the Chemours plant. This is Bladen County Highway 87 at the Cumberland County line. The Cape Fear River is that blue long water body here at the base of the slide. The production plant is up gradient over 100 feet in elevation from the river itself. And you see these different arrows, and these are important because this is how these man-made compounds entered the environment. A significant source was through the stack, aerial deposition. Why is that important? Because it means they unfortunately had the ability to travel a great distance from the plant. Compared to something like a gasoline leak at a gas station, doesn't go very far, stays very close to that tank, that source. This is very different. The processed water that left the plant at one time went into the river, and we'll talk about the updates on how these are being addressed. And an arrow for seeps, which talks about underground groundwater that surfaces at this area and ultimately enters the Cape Fear. And all of these arrows show you some of the sources of how these compounds entered the environment and ultimately may have also impacted residents' drinking water wells. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So the next slide gets into the specifics of groundwater testing and a lot of what we're talking about this afternoon when it comes to private wells. And you see in the exact picture here, the Cape Fear River would be on the far right. There are a series of red dots. Those are monitoring wells showing you detections of Gen X and other PFAS, these man-made compounds in groundwater underneath the plant property. That's what the red dots are. The white polygons, those are the actual production areas of the plant. The green cross-hatched area is the 2,000 plus acre property referred to as Fayetteville Works. Because there's not only the Chemours Corporation, there's other manufacturing entities on this 2,000 acre property. So the short summary here, we found high levels of these man-made PFAS compounds in monitoring wells, the red dots that are depicted in the picture. We then knew once there were detections on the plant property, there was going to need to be community engagement, work on the property to determine impact from these PFAS compounds. There were some important developments. As we said, there was not a lot of health information, but in 2017, DHHS was able to calculate an initial provisional health goal for drinking water for Gen X, and that's the second bullet, that 140 level. That was followed in 2022 by EPA setting a nationwide Based on new and, more relevant data at that time in 2022, EPA set the level actually at 10 part per trillion in drinking water for this Gen X compound. Our work went from on-site to around the surrounding communities. Following bullet, we tested several properties, unfortunately found these compounds off the plant property and also in private wells, leading our state agency, DEQ, to require Chemours to test additional wells in the area. And we'll talk a little bit more about the final point here, but it is also important to note that this work does extend because of impacts to the river all the way down into New Hanover, Columbus, Pender, and Brunswick counties. So we did send Chemours a letter in 2021 asking for additional work to be done. So the next slide, we talk about the consent order, and this is an important document when folks ask about how's my well getting sampled, what are the options, if my well has these compounds, what is Chemours required to do. This consent order governs those particular requirements. It was signed in 2019 between Chemours, DEQ, and Cape Fear River Watch, an additional stakeholder and environmental group. It does include requirements to reduce air emissions. That was one of the main sources, these man-made compounds coming out the stack, and that needed to be controlled. Also, additional contributions to the Cape Fear River needed to immediately be addressed on an accelerated schedule. Why is that important? The Cape Fear is a significant drinking water source for hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians, right? And also to notify downstream public utilities if there was a potential for further discharge of these PFAS compounds, and definitely to sample drinking water wells and if the compounds were found to provide alternatives. So on the next slide, it provides an illustration of what we've been working on as a state agency and requiring Chemours to do. So as you look at that plant production property and those stacks in the center, the two cylinders, you'll see now there's a red X. That's where a control technology, a thermal oxidizer, people refer to it as a TO, was installed in order to keep these compounds from entering the atmosphere, coming back down with rainwater or as dry deposition. We're on slide 8 if you follow along. The processed wastewater has no longer been allowed to be discharged to the Cape Fear River. That's an additional red X. There's a capture and treatment technology that treats now stormwater and other groundwater that flows to the river, along with the seeps, that underground groundwater that used to flow directly to the river that has these man-made compounds in it is also being treated. So not only are we focused on making sure communities are protected, but that we're turning off the spigot, turning off the tap of these PFAS that come from the plant itself. So that's a good illustration to understand the ongoing work. On slide 9, this is one of the major areas of focus for the remaining man-made compounds, Gen X and other PFAS, that were flowing underground to the river on a daily basis. So a 6,000-foot underground wall is currently being constructed. They built over 3,000 feet of this underground wall, which will stop groundwater from the plant property reaching the Cape Fear River. It is coupled with a series of wells that pull the groundwater out in front of the wall and then treat that water to remove the PFAS. That way, this groundwater that is contaminated is not allowed to continually flow to the river, which once again is a major drinking water source for North Carolinians. So that project's over halfway done. It's installed through a one-pass installation by the DeWin Company. We're pleased that this is moving forward on track. The next slide just talks a little further about this remediation system, including the groundwater extraction wells. They are in front of the wall. So the wall will stop groundwater, but then you have to do something with that water once it's impeded. These wells remove the groundwater, treat it so that it no longer is sending PFAS, to include Gen X, to the Cape Fear River. It will flow ultimately at about 1,000 gallons per minute, these 70 extraction wells. So we want to touch on not only protecting communities and the private well work, but the significant work to stop these man-made compounds from entering the environment. So the next slide, slide 11, talks specifically about working with communities, the consent order requiring sampling of private wells, and if these compounds are found at certain levels, providing alternate water, and we'll talk more about that. But the consent order establishes not only for Gen X, but 11 other compounds, a threshold of 10 part per trillion. If they are found in private wells, Chemours has to transition the house to alternate water, usually bottled water, or what's called a voucher system, a card where the resident can buy water at their local grocery store, wherever they go for their normal supplies. And then they are eventually transitioned either to a municipal water connection, if it's available in the community, or a filtration system, which I'll show you some of the pictures of that. If the home does have that Gen X compound, which is associated with Chemours, at or above that EPA health advisory, they are eligible for a whole house system. It's called a granular activated carbon system that treats all of the water that goes into the home, or that municipal water connection. For the other 11 compounds, they trigger what's called a reverse osmosis. It's an under the sink type filter. And if any of these 11 compounds add up, actually 12 compounds add up to 70 part per trillion or more, they also trigger filtration. So the take-home message here is the alternate water requirement from the consent order not only speaks to individual compounds, it speaks to a summation. If these compounds are found, added up above 70, then that also triggers filtration for the homeowner. On slide 12, it's important to note that not only are we working in Robeson, Sampson, Bladen, and Cumberland counties, but based on impacts to the river, as we briefly already covered, there's also work in the lower Cape Fear region. So DEQ did send a letter to Chemours in November of 2021, requiring them to submit a plan to conduct an environmental assessment in the lower Cape Fear region, and to also put forth a drinking water compliance plan in order to sample drinking water wells and protect downstream communities. And so the sampling of private wells is critical, because one of the primary exposure routes to these man-made compounds is through ingestion or drinking these compounds. So if we can stop that exposure route, that goes a long ways to reducing, eliminating exposure to PFAS. On the next slide, we have some pictures related to the private well sampling work. This is important to our agency, DEQ, ensuring we have staff here from air quality to waste management, all involved with environmental monitoring of PFAS, but also making sure that our agency can follow behind Chemours, that we can help residents get their wells sampled. If they have questions or have a need that Chemours has not been able to address, our agency has sampled over 1,000 private wells related just to the Chemours plant. And so we field phone calls each day, help people with their questions related to the consent order, alternate water provisions, but we're also in the field sampling. And that's important because this sampling can be $300, $340 per sample. So a lot of times as a private well owner, you may be asked, test it for heavy metals, test it for pesticides, test it for bacteriological samples. But those often do not cost $300, which is a significant expense. So this testing is provided under the consent order free of charge. When DEQ performs the well testing, it also is done at no cost to the homeowner. And then we work with DHHS to help homeowners review their laboratory results, understand what's in their well water, and important next steps. On the next slide, we're touching on community interest, and there's a lot of community interest. We touched on the cost of some of this sampling for PFAS. A lot of folks are wanting to understand how they eliminate their exposure to these compounds. You know, can they boil the water, which you can't boil the water and get rid of PFAS? Will a Brita filter work from the hardware store? How effective is it compared to something that may be several $1,000s, meaning a reverse osmosis system? So we've worked to put forth information on those fronts. These pictures show community members at one of our community meetings in Bladen County Folks are very interested in maps of where the sampling's occurring, where they live, and understanding the proximity of this work to their communities. And then what are the options, moving forward to include alternate water? On the next slide, we're just touching a little more on community outreach. We had a lot of community meetings from the Lower Cape Fear to all around Bladen County, Robeson County related to the Chemours plant to talk about private well sampling, talk about the controls being implemented from the consent order. This was a community meeting in Fayetteville where over 400 people attended that night to hear about the updates related to this site and the alternate water provisions. But we're there to address community concerns, make sure the residents understand where information is posted, relevant phone numbers that they can reach out to at DEQ, Health Department, and even DEHHS to answer their questions. And a lot of emphasis on the ongoing private well testing and the importance of daily communication if people need their questions answered. The next slide touches on the current work. The picture here is a little small, but it has a lot of information. I'll give you the take-home message. In the center of the circle is the 2,000-acre Fayetteville Works property where Chemours operates. You'll see these series of dots from brown to yellow to orange. The short message here is over 10,000 private wells have been sampled around this property. And since these compounds were distributed to include through the atmosphere, the private well sampling includes into this area, Sampson County, near the Stedman area, over 20 miles from the plant. So when I gave the example, like sometimes a gas station may have a tank that leaks, that fuel stays very close to that gas station. We clean it up, we remediate it. This scenario is very different. The impact to communities, the impact to property owners, when you're talking about an area 20 miles from the actual plant location. You'll see that under that legal document, the consent order, there's over 5,000 properties that qualify for some type of treatment based on these contaminants being found in their well water. 1,000 of them actually have Gen X above that 10 part per trillion level. So it's a huge amount of testing. It's testing that's necessary, but also testing that continues in this area. And we want to make sure people know that this free testing is offered, that they have the phone number to call, and that they have resources to help them answer any questions they have. On the next slide, we just have a picture of some of our sampling team, Josh and Ann in the field sampling. It's important to know that whether DEQ comes out or Chemours, and Chemours is primarily doing their sampling through their contractor Parsons, most of the time you don't need to enter a residence. You can do it on the external side of the home or the property. You don't need to go into people's homes. And all personal protective and social distancing requirements are being followed. But there's some important phone numbers in the third bullet here for folks not only in the Wilmington area, but also where we are this afternoon in Sampson County, especially that greater Stedman coming out of Cedar Creek, Cumberland County, into Stedman, Sampson County. The phone number to call to request private well testing. That really is the first step. And once again, it's at no cost to the homeowner. And like I mentioned, it's not necessarily Chemours that would come out to a property. It's an environmental contractor that Chemours has hired. We hear people say, we don't want them on our property. We don't trust them. We'd rather DEQ come. We totally understand that, but we also say it's really not the people that work for Chemours. It's a contractor that's an environmental consulting firm. When we talk about the Lower Cape Fear region, this last bullet, just briefly, folks often ask, well, how did these compounds make their way to Wilmington, Brunswick County, or parts of Pender? The current theory is based on the compounds entering the river, the Cape Fear flowing to the Atlantic, the different communities in that region of the Lower Cape Fear sourcing drinking water from the river. That drinking water was conveyed through municipal water lines, through wastewater lines, and at times they do leak. And those leaks may have led to some of the impacts to groundwater and ultimately private wells in that region. There are also some other areas of PFAS, known PFAS in that region, and also areas that are close to the Cape Fear's floodplain that may have led to these PFAS impacts. So the next one I won't focus too much on, but I'll just mention the outreach thus far in that lower Cape Fear region, New Hanover, Columbus, Pender, and Columbus counties, has included over 100,000 letters that Chemours mailed out to property owners, asking them to get their wells sampled. One of the main criteria is that the private drinking water well needs to be the main source of drinking water, not that the garden is irrigated from it and you have a municipal water connection, but it's actually the main drinking water source. You'll see some of the facts and figures based on properties that are eligible for sampling, whether it's Pender or other counties. And the last bullet goes into detail of the exact PFAS compounds that each well are tested for. So it's way more than Gen X. It's Gen X plus another 11 compounds. But one of our areas of focus for DEQ is with the 100,000 letters, only about a 30% response rate has occurred. And that's the important first step. Get your well sampled, it's free of charge, but a lot of folks have not responded. Either they're not interested or didn't understand the letter, or it's a vacant property. So that's something we're following up actively on. The next slide touches on some of the specific well sampling numbers for the region. You'll see the total sampled in the lower Cape Fear. Means the greater Wilmington, Brunswick, Columbus, and Pender area. Over 1,000 drinking water wells in that region qualify for alternate water, like the 5,000 plus here in the greater Bladen, Sampson, and Cumberland area. Also touches on the amount, that fourth bullet, that have that Gen X compound above the federal health goal, 140 of those properties. And all of these will either qualify for activated carbon or what's called reverse osmosis treatment. If there's a water line available, the last bullet, the consent order does require Chemours to complete that connection to municipal water free of charge. And if it's the Gen X compound that's at or above 10 part per trillion, to also cover the water bill, which is a big concern for property owners who have not had a water bill with a private well. Then they hear they may be able to connect to municipal water for free, but then there's that $40 or $50 a month water bill that's a significant concern. So on the next slide, we're just showing an image of the lower Cape Fear private well sampling. The red dots show you where Gen X is at or above that federal health goal of 10 part per trillion. The yellow dots show you where there's other Chemours PFAS that have been detected that are also triggering alternate water. And once again, this is a 4-county map of the lower Cape Fear region. The follow-up slide is some additional work we've been doing looking at an additional compound besides Gen X. It's the compound that's really predominant in this lower Cape Fear region, the PFMOAA compound. It's a shorter chain carbon compound than Gen X, potentially behaves in the environment a little bit different, and so we are using these heat-type maps to show the concentrations of this PFMOAA compound in the lower Cape Fear region. It's also done to share with communities so they know where the detections are, if they live close to that area, and to really encourage them to get their wells sampled and their neighbors. So the next slide really talks about what's next. These are the solutions that are required under the consent order. The upper right photo shows a whole house activated carbon treatment system. It filters all the water coming into the property. The 2 large canisters contain that activated carbon that are able to remove PFAS. The smaller canisters in that picture are iron and sediment filters. A lot of times the water quality from groundwater is not suitable for immediate filtration, so those filters help with that process. The bottom picture shows the RO, or what stands for reverse osmosis filtration, and these filters are offered when it's not Gen X that's found in private well water, but 1 or more of the other 11 PFAS. The next slide shows some work DEQ did around the Chemours plant, and the take-home message here is we've collected a lot of data over the course of the year to make sure these systems are effective, that we can let communities know that they will successfully remove these compounds and provide them a free, PFAS-free drinking water source. The next slide is a great resource. We provided some handouts to the board this afternoon. We take this handout to all of our community meetings. It has testing information. Even though this testing is free through the Comores consent order, there are labs that can also help homeowners if they wanted to do additional testing. And then to the right, the fact sheet has filtration systems. There are different effectiveness and just gives homeowners a lot of options if they're currently not eligible for a filter under the Comores consent order. And as I touched on in the next slide here, once data is received, Comores is required to transition folks very quickly within 3 days to bottled water, or that bottled water voucher where they can go to a local store or grocery store and purchase water. It's loaded with enough money to purchase water for 90 days, and then the money is reloaded to the card. But the point is, the main exposure is really through drinking these compounds, and stopping that direct ingestive route of exposure is really important, and doing that quickly. On the next slide, we're just showing some resources we have, not only for the Lower Cape Fear region, but all of the DEQ information related to PFAS and our ongoing work related to Gen X. So there's a wealth of information between our state agency and also DHHS to help folks if they have questions related to PFAS, but also our contact information if they'd like to speak with us directly. And the follow-up slide just talks about some work that's beyond Comores. We've been working at some specific areas around the state. You may have heard nationally or within North Carolina, aqueous film forming foam, or AFFF, that's used by fire departments, used a lot by the military, used at airports. AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, can also have these man-made compounds in it. So this is a picture of some work outside of the Greensboro International Airport, where we've been working with the Guilford County Health Department to sample private wells for PFAS. We did find some of these man-made compounds in drinking water. The city of Greensboro already realized that based on impacts to their drinking water reservoir, which is the large blue bodies to the top of this picture. And so this slide simply touches on some of DEQ's ongoing work beyond Comores to sample for PFAS, sample in residential drinking water wells, and to provide options where we can for safe drinking water sources. So as I finish here with the last slide, there's a lot of ongoing work, not only here in Sampson County and Bladen, Cumberland, Robeson, around the Comores plant, but also in the Lower Cape Fear region, where private well sampling is still occurring in all 8 of those counties. We are working with local utilities to connect people to municipal water where that's feasible and municipal water is available. We're actively working on all the remediation systems related to Comores to stop these PFAS from entering the environment, to include the barrier wall, and also doing a lot of additional environmental assessment work. What are some other areas where these PFAS may have entered the environment? So the 4th bullet touches on biosolids, a material that comes from wastewater treatment plants, is often land applied in the agricultural sector. Is that another potential source of these compounds entering the environment? And also our additional private well work, as I just touched on through the Bernard Allen program. So I really appreciate the opportunity to touch on private well sampling for PFAS, to share with the board this ongoing work. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Scott, for that very insightful presentation. Let me ask the board, do you have questions?
I have a question. I know you're not, at this point, it doesn't sound like testing anything other than private wells. Are you doing any testing around the Sampson County landfill? Because I know there have been some sampling showing that there is perhaps leachate from the Sampson County landfill that's depositing PFAS into a couple of the adjoining smaller bodies of water.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we did work with the Sampson County landfill a few years back to sample their leachate. That information is on the DEQ website. There was a collective study of several municipal solid waste landfills, to include Sampson, to test for PFAS, including Gen X. That data is on our website. Be glad to share it. We're following up on that data with all of our municipal solid waste landfills, including the GFL Sampson County landfill, to test their landfill leachate, groundwater, and surface water for PFAS, starting after July 1st. And we're actually working with the GFL Sampson facility on their specific work plan right now. So North Carolina has 43 facilities, the Sampson County facilities, one of 43. We've asked for all of them statewide to collect this PFAS data starting after July 1st. The Sampson facility is actually on a little bit more of an expedited timeline, and we're working on their work plan right now. So we have some initial data, but this next work plan and data collection will go far beyond that initial leachate data that's on our website.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Hello again. We saw each other at the Acme Delco Regalwood well briefing. And I asked this question then, so I'll ask it again. Why only drinking wells or wells for primary source of drinking water? And I say that because I know you've gone all over, and this is for my board members here. This is an EJ and Equity Board. And so we have people in areas that are in supermarket deserts. They rely on produce to supplement their food, their meals. They also use it to sell as a means of additional income. They sell it at farmers markets, particularly starting at this time of the year. They are using those wells as their sources of irrigation for their farms that they are eating and that they are then selling to people like me in Brunswick County, and saying, hey, here's some fresh grown produce. But yet those wells, if they are not hooked up as their primary source of water, are not being tested. So that's number one. Go ahead.
Yeah, great question, and good to see you again also. The well sampling, I would say, is beyond just the private wells that are used for drinking water. Our DWR program has sampled all of the ambient wells for PFAS in the region, so we have a growing data set that's not drinking water wells, and I remember your question because it was a great one. We are looking at additional wells that are being installed to understand where these compounds are in the aquifer. So when you go underground, there's different levels of the groundwater, superficial all the way down to the different deeper aquifers and then bedrock. And so that data will help to tell us where the contamination is. A lot of times it's shallower, like 100 feet or less, not always. But if the irrigation well is put into bedrock, and we've heard this in Bladen County, 300 feet deep, there may be no PFAS found, and we've heard that. And so that's how we're starting to address your question and others who have asked about why is it only drinking water wells that have been sampled when irrigation wells may be removing these compounds and spreading them.
Well, remember that some of these irrigation, these drinking water wells, are just additional sources of water now for some of these folks. They are hooked up to a local or municipal or county water, but they're using their old well because it takes so it's cheaper, and it takes so much water to do their garden, and so they have a source hooked up to a county or regional water source, but they also have this well. That well, that private well, is coming under this testing system.
Right, yeah. If the municipal water is the primary source, they're paying a water bill, then you're correct. It's not coming under this initial plan, but it could be included under the broader assessment. And so we've talked to Chemours about that. You know, if there are wells that are not primary drinking water wells, but they're wells close to where we need to test, then also test those, to your point. I'll also say it's a very active discussion on the agricultural sector, how crops, plants, how these compounds move through their roots into the fruit or other part of the plants. NC State is doing work on this. I think Dr. Duckworth is the professor. So it is a concern we hear from communities. We've heard that some people are so concerned they don't want to grow a backyard garden anymore. So we're trying to address those concerns with what the options are and what the scientific data shows us, meaning how these compounds can move in plants.
Speaking of local backyard gardens, have we looked at rain barrels? Because some people went from their private wells to collecting rain barrels based on environmental groups, Cape Fear River Watch and Coastal Federation. Have we looked to see, make sure that that diffuser is doing what it's supposed to do further away from Bladen County, down in Columbus or Brunswick, New Hanover?
Right, once the thermal oxidizer was put on the plant, the ongoing testing has showed that those PFAS are no longer emitted through the plant stacks.
Okay.
There is some lower Cape Fear data that has shown some detections in that region. We don't know that it's tied to atmospheric deposition, but it's been collected through some rainwater. You know, our Division of Air Quality program is still looking at that. UNCW, there's a lot of collaboration with North Carolina's university system trying to look at this. So your questions are spot on. I think my message for the board is we have to make sure people first have a safe drinking water supply, and then we're actively working on these connections to produce, what's consumed. Are these compounds present that people may be interested in growing or consuming?
Now, to answer your why you only got it,
Let me just say, does anyone else have any questions?
I just wanted to ask, how much money is in the Bernard Allen fund?
Oh, yeah, great question. So the General Assembly provided an additional appropriation. We usually have about 400,000, covers a little bit of staff, and then it covers all the sampling, filters, et cetera. There was additional appropriation for the General Assembly for several hundred thousand, basically $300,000 for that program for PFAS. So the real answer to your question would be that 300,000. We have asked for that to be continual, meaning not a one-time allocation, but reoccurring each budget cycle, because we feel like the scope of this, we don't have the scope fully identified, would be the other message. So that funding to provide people alternate water, and that program historically has pieces related to the lower income residents and how they qualify in order to get those free of charge. So that's what we're working on, and to make sure we have some options, but we're trying to make sure we can spread that money as far as we can right now.
Veronica, quick question, quick response.
quick question would be, and I had two left over, so I'll go with the last one. 30%, many of the people told me that they thought it was junk mail from Chemours.
Right.
Like, because Chemours has sent all of us in their area letters telling, propaganda telling us what great neighbors they were.
Right.
And so they got the well request and tossed it.
Right.
So I think that has to do with your 30% response rate.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback. That is a big point of focus. 100,000 letters, 66,000 unique properties, 30% response rate. We really want to get that number up. Free testing, it's really the first starting point. So thank you for the comment. We agree.
So in general, actually, 30% is a response rate usually that you see.
That's a typical.
That's a typical response, just, but your point is well taken as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And for your answers to your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, I would like to invite Michael Scott, Director of DEQ Division of Waste Management, to discuss well water sampling for PFAS. We just did that one. Thank you. I would like to now invite Paula Hemmer, Senior Environmental Engineer with the Statewide Initiatives Division at North Carolina DOT, to provide a presentation on the Clean Transportation Plan to the board.
Also, can the board please remember to, we can actually use these mics now, if y'all can remember just to speak into them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Paula Hemmer, and as they said, I'm an engineer with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, formerly with DEQ, so I know a lot of the members here, and it's fun to come back and talk to everybody from a different lens. So I'm sure you all are familiar with this work that's been done in the state over the last year and a half, so I won't explain all of it. We're at the final, report has been issued, and so to start off with some background, I think you all are fairly aware of the executive orders that have been issued. They've been discussed a lot at DEQ. The ones related specifically to transportation are highlighted in green here, and the first three have to do with goals to increase the number of zero emission vehicles in the state of North Carolina and the sale of those vehicles. The second to last one has to do with the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which Maya Hoon will be discussing after me. And then, of course, the zero emission vehicle infrastructure needs assessment, and that is currently ongoing at NCDOT and should be, I believe it's due in September, October of this year. The Clean Transportation Plan, first and foremost, is a plan for all of North Carolina, and it was required under Executive Order 246. The plan will be advocating for both public, private, and nonprofit participation, as well as everyday citizens, because many households have a car. They make the decision on the vehicle and the transportation that they can afford for themselves. So we are also considering all layers of government. Transportation is planned and implemented at all different levels: the federal level, the state level. There are local planning organizations as well as regional planning organizations, and there's very many plans. And in order to implement funding, you have to be on the plan. So transportation plans are extremely important in order to move things forward in the transportation world. And lastly, the plan from the outset had a focus on equitable outcomes. This gives you an idea of the participants that helped to develop the plan. There were over 220 people that worked on the plan. The transportation sector is changing rapidly, and the types of technologies and types of practices that are being encouraged to lower emissions from this sector. And so there's also, as we said, there's a great diversity of groups that are involved in transportation, and we wanted to make sure that we had a broad enough base to help us work on these problems. So as you can see, it was state agencies and planning organizations and local governments, nonprofits, advocacy groups, environmental groups, private companies, especially technology type companies. The electric utilities were there, and of course, researchers and industry associations. And of course, we also had equity and environmental justice groups taking part in our plan. There were 5 primary work groups that met over 30 times and generated over 3,000 ideas. So that's a significant amount of collective thinking. So I think the department's very proud of that. These 5 work groups were light-duty vehicles, medium and heavy-duty vehicles, fleet transitions. There are many different fleets that operate in the transportation world, both bus fleets and private transportation fleets to move cargo and merchandise. And of course, the most important clean energy is the energy you don't use. So that is vehicle miles traveled and reducing the vehicle miles traveled by North Carolinians. It's the equivalent of energy efficiency in the transportation world. Is everybody familiar with that term, vehicle miles traveled? And how it's estimated by the Department of Transportation based on both surveys and registrations of cars and various other things that we do. But you'll often see someone on the side of the road counting vehicles. So. With the advent of smartphones and things like that, there's a lot more data available on vehicle miles traveled and how people use transportation now. So that's a very important aspect of planning for transportation going forward. Lastly, there's infrastructure. And of course, the big one is electric vehicle charging that everybody's talking about now, but there's also other types of infrastructure that we need to look at and plan for the future, especially with some of the very innovative modes of transportation people are coming up with. I want to address the affordability aspects. This is in the report, and based on research that was done for the report, 6% of households do not have access to a vehicle in North Carolina. The chart in the upper right corner there gives you the breakdown of the percentage of households without access to a vehicle by race, so that you can see some communities are facing more difficulty accessing transportation or accessing a vehicle specifically. And the map is the Justice 40 disadvantaged census tracts in North Carolina. 30% of the census tracts are considered disadvantaged. It looks like a lot more because there's so much blue on that map. However, if you look at the number of census tracts as you move into those city areas, there's very many census tracts in those areas because of dense population. And over half of the population currently lives in 13 counties, putting a lot of stress on those counties and eliminating a lot of opportunities in these rural counties to have population, to have transit systems, because there's fewer and fewer people living in rural communities. So. This slide gives kind of the structure. You know, we had thousands of recommendations coming out of the work groups, and so we had to put them into buckets that people could understand. And so these are our 4 buckets. These 4 categories include infrastructure. Well, I'm going to start with governance, infrastructure, funding, and financing, and community engagement. And so these 4 buckets were the underlying strength of them is in the partnerships and in recognizing the need for equitable transportation. So the governance bucket includes, as we said, all parts of government, local, regional, state, and federal, as well as laws, policies, rules, codes, and facilitation of changing transportation, transforming transportation in our state. The infrastructure, as I'm sure you're aware, is primarily focused right now on electricity, like we said, but it is also the underlying infrastructure for other potential fuel sources and energy sources, including, how does the electricity grid need to change based on this increased use of electricity by the state, and moving into things like hydrogen potentially, which is right now recognized by the Biden administration as the primary, secondary source of fuel, clean fuel, that could be used specifically for heavy and medium duty trucks. And then we get into funding and financing. All of this costs lots and lots of money, and we need new financing mechanisms as well to help businesses and citizens do this transformation as well. So there's a whole group of recommendations related to that. And lastly, we have our communications and engagement, recognizing that you need to reach out to private companies as well as private citizens and engage them in this transformation. We need all of the partners there at the table to help. So there's going to need to be a lot of different strategies and a lot of different levels of communication and a lot of different modes of communication. Go to the next slide. Oh, that's me. So these are the key recommendations that came out that were brought to after many, many meetings. These were the key recommendations that DOT felt should be most prominent coming out of this plan. So these are only a select number of recommendations. The first one is to create a dedicated NCDOT clean transportation team. This would be a group of people within DOT that would work on this plan and facilitating moving forward with the plan. Secondly, there is the state would like to align all of the agencies through a clean transportation task force. This would be similar to the Climate Council Interagency Task force that currently exists, or climate council, I guess. And that potentially could be housed under the climate council. That has not been worked out yet. But moving forward with transitioning all of the fleets within state government and infrastructure that would be required to move those fleets to clean is a lot of work for the state. And by coordinating it all together, I think we'll do a lot better job of moving this forward and making sure that there's policies and procedures in place to do this. The next one is specifically of interest to this group, increasing equitable outcomes in transportation planning projects. As I said, transportation planning is an ongoing and complicated process at all levels of government, federal, state, and local and regional planning. So, like I said, if it's not in the plan, it doesn't get funded. So it's really important that as we move forward, we recognize that if we want equitable outcomes in the state, we need to have that in our planning. And the next one is to ensure access and affordability to clean transportation for citizens. And this one is, like I said, it's a key factor in all of the work that the work groups did. And then there is to evaluate and update project prioritization and programs, and partnering with utilities to promote clean transportation. If we move on to the funding and financing recommendations, the first one is to maximize existing funding to support clean transportation outcomes. And the second one is to evaluate new funding that advances clean transportation outcomes. And while these are seem fairly similar, it's recognizing that the state and the federal government are putting up a lot of money in the next several years to, there's existing funding sources that we've had over time, but the infrastructure bill has presented a lot of new opportunities, and so we're trying to work on how to focus those opportunities to do clean transportation in the state. And last is infrastructure, and the recommendations are to evaluate and deploy clean transportation infrastructure to support all types of vehicles, fleet vehicles and applications, and that is being supported with funding from the federal government. Currently, there are several efforts to within EPA and DOT to allow for electricity vehicle infrastructure to be built in the state, in all of the states, and specifically in North Carolina. And lastly, to expand transportation demand management strategies. These strategies include some of the work that was done under previous federal funding, such as building the what do you call them? Roundabouts, yes, sorry. No, that's okay, I couldn't think of it. Roundabouts, and there's other traffic demand systems that were done under ARA funding. A lot of that funding changed transportation in a minor way, but it had a big impact on the amount of congestion that traffic causes, and then that has a big impact on fuel use and air emissions. So while it seems small, not stopping your car for a stoplight does have a big impact when everyone's doing it. So anyway, I know a lot of people are unhappy with those roundabouts, but they are very useful for as a control mechanism for limiting emissions and fuel use. So this is the specific recommendation for increasing equitable outcomes in transportation planning. I thought you would want to see that. There's a lot of words on this page, but this is to enhance existing environmental justice efforts and promote equitable outcomes by involving these partners to inform the implementation of these plans that we will be developing, these specific work group plans that are coming out. And to identify equity metrics to incorporate into projects and to promote accountability. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. So we want to be able to measure what's happening in the state and figure out the barriers to change, and then implement new measures to remove injustices in our system. So, and these metrics would specifically target population identification, investment decision-making, and program impact assessments. And some of the supporting strategies that would work toward that goal would be to assist with creating new engagement and decision-making processes at both the state and local levels, and partner with community-based organizations, and partner with healthcare, economic development, workforce training to align these incentives and initiatives. We do, I don't know if you're familiar with Steps for Growth. A lot of that is being discussed at the State Energy Office. It's a program to do workforce development in the community colleges, and specifically to promote internships at the high school and community college level. The North Carolina A&T University received $23 million for that work, and we're working very closely with them on implementation of electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. And another one that was brought up as an important to equity could be the development of zero emission delivery zones. Truck traffic on our roads has increased dramatically, and we could create kind of pilot projects where they would be completely zero emissions from delivery of goods into the zone. This is the other important activity. I think am I out of time?
Yes, I was gonna ask you.
Yeah. So I think this one is just to ensure access and affordability to clean transportation, specifically with the Justice 40 targets, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, and pursuing grant resources, specifically the charging and fueling infrastructure grant that has recently been released, and we're already talking about how to use that money more effectively, and to provide technical assistance and partnerships to businesses and small fleet owners. And the last one I think is pretty obvious to you all. We kind of discussed it already, which was the community engagement and specific measures we plan on doing there. I think that the engagements of recognized community leaders in these underserved communities is going to be very, very important, rather than us telling them, they will tell us. So I think that bottom-up approach will be important for this, and I think we've seen that in the state in recent years. And I think that's it. The work groups are the big thing. The biggest important thing to do is get these work groups back together to start facilitating moving forward with this plan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Keller. Actually, there's a second part to this.
Yes, that's
Before we
mine.
ask questions, so I'd like to invite Maya Hoon, Title VI and Environmental Justice Coordinator at DEQ, to provide a presentation to the board on the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule Environmental Justice Analysis, and then we'll open up for discussion, questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Vice Chair Mary Ann. My name is Maya Hoon. My name is Maya Hoon, and I am the Title VI and Environmental Justice Coordinator. And I had the honor of getting to meet all of you and have great discussions earlier today. So I appreciate getting to work with all of you, and I'm looking forward to having productive and meaningful conversations moving forward with all of you as well. And so I am going to talk today about our environmental justice analysis for the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. And it's important to note that this is a proposal. Here it is. Sorry, just trying to get the slides caught up. And so we're going to go over today briefly what the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, or ACT, is. And then I'll go over the purpose and the goal of our proposed environmental justice analysis, and then we'll go into the potential methods of how we're going to go about doing that and how the analysis might work. And then we'll just summarize everything at the end as well. And so the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, or ACT rule, came from Governor Roy Cooper's Executive Order 271. And what this would entail is that medium and heavy-duty vehicle manufacturers would sell an increasing percentage of these types of vehicles across the state. Of these types of vehicles, but zero emission across the state. And so from that, the ACT rule will lead to reduced air pollution in the state. And so the goal for our environmental justice analysis is to ultimately understand where emissions are coming from in the state, and then to understand those where emission reduction benefits may occur from an increase in zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. So to understand this, we would have to answer two different questions, which would be, the first one is, where in the state are medium heavy duty vehicles potentially contributing to more emissions? And then secondly, what populations are within these areas? To answer that first question of where the vehicles are potentially contributing to more emissions, we're interested in looking at two different data sets. So the first would be route-based sources, and that's essentially roads that these vehicles travel on, so possibly interstates, arterials, local routes. And then the second type of data we want to look at we're calling idling sources. So those would be the areas where maybe more of these vehicles are parked but not actively working to their maximum capacity. So they're turned on and producing emissions, staying in a one particular area. And I'll go more into detail about where those areas may be in a future slide. But using that source data, we would pull in socio-demographic data to then examine populations of interest so that we can pursue that question of what populations are in these areas. And for this analysis, the socio-demographic indicators we're interested in are race and ethnicity, age and sex, poverty, household income, disability, limited English proficiency, and tribal organization. And all of these are our Title VI indicators that we use in our environmental justice analysis reports for permits. So we would essentially be using those same indicators to analyze on a statewide level if groups included in these indicators could benefit from the ACT rule. And additionally, these are some indicators that some health studies have found to have linked increased exposure to major roads where there may be more emissions. And so in our proposed analysis, we would first go into the route-based sources. So we would want to know where on these roads that medium heavy-duty vehicles travel on, where may these vehicles have higher vehicle miles traveled, which Paula had mentioned in her presentation. But in technical terms, vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, is the total miles traveled by vehicles in a specific area over a period of 1 year. So in general, other programs have interpreted higher VMT to be linked with higher emissions, and then the opposite would be true. So lower VMT, potentially lower emissions. And so for these vehicles, while they're going in transit from one place to another, we want to kind of total up those VMTs in the census tracts using 2019 traffic data. And the reason why we're looking at 2019 is because we want to get a glimpse at road conditions in more quote-unquote normal times. So 2020 was the pandemic, less road use. 2021 was the Ukraine-Russia conflict, also less road use, and then 2022 is kind of like a recovery period. So 2019 would kind of capture road conditions in more normal conditions, road travel in normal conditions. And so what we see on the next slide is are some maps that the Division of Air Quality at DEQ presented at a stakeholder meeting in March. And essentially what this shows are different areas where there are some of our socio-demographic indicators of interest, and then the NCDOT state-maintained interstates, along with the average annual daily truck traffic. So you can kind of see or get a glimpse of where on those interstates truck traffic is higher, but annual daily truck traffic is part of the equation for knowing that VMT of the truck travel. So the VMTs, we're using some of the average annual daily truck traffic data to generate those VMT totals, and this next map shows the total sum of annual VMTs in millions within the census tracts. And what it's getting across is that the darker red portions are areas, are census tracts with higher total VMTs. And as it gets more pale in the yellow areas, those are areas with less total annual VMTs. So again, the higher VMT totals indicate higher emissions, and then lower indicate lower emissions. So the darker red areas may be areas that may benefit from the ACT rule. And then this next table, this shows a comparison of the census tracts with over 10 million VMT, and basically those average populations within the socio-demographic indicators that we're interested in, and how that compares with the rest of the state. And so, to backtrack a little bit, we're taking the VMT totals from that other slide, and then this is the next part where we link it to the socio-demographic data to get a better idea of who may benefit, or which populations may benefit, where in North Carolina may emission reductions benefit, where emission reduction benefits may be felt. So to summarize how to interpret this table, the highlighted category, American Indian and Alaska Native, this indicates that the census tracts with over 10 million VMT has a higher average population of American Indian or Alaska Natives than the average of this population in census tracts across the state. So in other words, these populations may benefit from the ACT rule. And now we kind of go more into the idling sources. We're interested in these areas.
Can I ask you to, sorry, move ahead, because we're out of time.
Sorry. We're interested in these areas because the medium heavy duty vehicles are not working at full capacity, so potentially more emissions from these areas. So if you have more idling sources, there's obviously increased vehicle idling and then potential increased air emissions. So there's a potential there for air quality to improve with ACT rule. And then those areas of interest may include areas where there are larger fleets of these vehicles. So freight centers, wholesale distribution, manufacturing centers, delivery and assortment, fulfillment centers like Amazon warehouses, ports, air cargo delivery sites, and military bases. And then these are maps that the Division of Air Quality shared at that March stakeholder meeting. It shows the different locations of transportation warehousing firms, manufacturing firms, and wholesale trade firms in North Carolina. So then we took those data points and we also applied more updated information from the 2023 multimodal freight plan. And we applied all those points to this map. And so you can see there are many, many idling sources in the state. So what that kind of shows is that perhaps the whole state really will benefit from the emissions reductions. But we do also want to take a look at some places where maybe there are more types of sources of air emissions. So maybe they have the transportation warehouse firms, manufacturing firms, wholesale trade firms. This map shows that those darker orange areas have all of those types of firms, all those types of idling sources. And then the lighter areas show that there's only one, or at least the pale orange areas show that there's only one type of idling source there. And so we could potentially link that to the sociodemographic data, do a similar kind of analysis, and produce that table that I had shown in a previous slide. But overall, to summarize real quick, we'd be looking at the sources for route-based emissions, so emissions while medium heavy-duty vehicles are in transit. Then we'd look at the idling sources, so emissions when the medium heavy-duty vehicles are in place, parked but turned on. And then we would link that to the question of what populations are in these areas, bring in the sociodemographic data of sociodemographic indicators of interest. And then from that, we can get a better idea of where emissions reduction benefits may occur from an increase in zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles as a result of the ACT rule in the state. And turn it back over to Vice Chair Mayer.
Thank you very much. And I have some questions from the board. Are there questions?
Not really a question, just a comment. Most of your data are,
Yeah, that's it.
yeah,
Go.
yeah, most of your data was from like 2014. Brunswick County had like nothing on it. I-140 was completed in late 2018, early 2019, which feeds into US 17, which goes into Warwick County. Brunswick County, between the years of 2010 and 2020, had a 32% growth in US Census population. And so, to me, this is somewhat like overcome by events because of the date of the population or date of the data use. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, on that note, actually, so the 2014 data that was shown, that was what the Division of Air Quality had shown at the March stakeholder meeting, but in this updated analysis, we pulled data points from a 2023 multimodal statewide freight plan. So that map previously, the map with all of those like colorful idling sources, they really
This one?
condensed.
This one that shows that Brunswick County is really idling all over the place?
Or
Or this one?
Danelle is holding up.
Yeah, this is, yeah, I see you updated for 2023 with the combined idling, but is everything, I mean, I'm a bit confused because you indicated that it was based on 2019, but data sources really were 2014, then you do have this updated for 2023.
Yeah.
So really, I'm not understanding where your data are coming from
So
based on your sources and understanding the modeling that you're doing.
Yeah, I probably didn't explain it very well then, so I apologize for that. The old data sources are from 2014. Those are the ones that the Division of Air Quality have presented. But the 2019 data, that is specifically for the route-based sources. That's the 2019 annual average daily truck traffic data that we're using. And then, so when we look at that second data set for the idling sources, that's a different data set. That's 2023 multimodal statewide freight plan.
And are you, for census tract, census, population census, sociodemographic, are you using, the, fact finder, or, I mean, are you using the census, I'm blanking now. The yearly estimates, or are you using the centennials?
For the 2019 data, we were using the 2010 census tracts. And then for,
Okay.
oh, yes.
2019 5-year average.
Oh,
You-
sorry,
okay, that's
thank
fine.
you,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay.
Sorry about that, thank you.
That would still be a problem though, based on what we were just talking about, because there was a major interstate open in 2019, in Brunswick County, that connected to I-140. And so if you're talking vehicle, trucks, idling, freight, all of your numbers would be skewed at that point. So that's just an example that I'm personally familiar with, so.
So the issue would be, is that data available? Is it available? You know, updated data to show the changes. So, I mean, I'm not asking you to answer that immediately, but you might want to take a look at that.
Look into
And then, you know, and just kind of let us know
Yeah,
exactly what it refers to, okay?
yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know the
Yeah,
answer,
that's-
but I will get back to you on that, I will look into it, thank you.
Well, let me ask a different kind of a question. Are there any incentives in place across all demographics to get individuals to use public transportation? Incentives, you know, like some jurisdictions have decided, and let me ask you a question. Maybe some jurisdictions have decided to have free transportation.
Yes, that
and
is correct.
especially in very crowded cities. So,
It's all done at a local level, so that decision-making is done at the local level on how to run the transit system. And we are under some of our EPA funding that DOT manages there. Some of the transit and some of the both EPA and DOT funding, we have seen requests to continue on that free transportation to help create incentives for people to use the public transportation system.
yeah, because I know at least in one particular jurisdiction that I'm very familiar with, you know, parking is horrendous in the downtown area. So what they are doing is, you know, providing free transportation so that people, that would be an incentive to use the bus to come into town. So I was just wondering if anything is that, so would DEQ have any role, though it is at the local level, would they have any role in suggesting or recommending that?
I'm not, I think that is, like I said, I think that's kind of, that sort of all happened during COVID, although some cities had moved to it already. But a lot of it happened also during COVID, for multiple reasons, obviously. But I'm not specifically aware of campaigns for free transportation, but in transit, but I know that every city that has transit is on an ongoing education, you know, effort to get people to use public transit, especially after COVID, and a lot of the ridership dropped off. So, you know, maybe we need to have our buses are safe campaign or something like that, you know, but I can bring it up with the group that runs that transit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you both ladies for your
And I wanted to
presentation.
point out, just to make sure that the ACT rule, just so everybody knows, is a rule that many states are considering adopting, and it's modeled after California. So we're not kind of on our own on this rule. A lot of states that, specifically the states that are involved in the Climate Alliance, the 15 states that are involved, they're all looking at this. So some of the states in Virginia, I believe, is one. So those states, you know, that are in the surrounding area, if they adopted this rule, would prop this up a lot better. So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have one quick question. And this has to do with transportation. I understand the rationale for ACT, but for folks who live in rural communities, there is not a real push for charging stations and many of the other things that are supposed to be promoted in this current environment. So are you looking at anything in particular to address concerns of rural communities?
So there's kind of two components to the electricity infrastructure funding and transportation. The first one is a statewide charging for interstate travel, and it'll be, you know, all 50 states have a set of pot of money to build out fast charging infrastructure across the states. Every 50 miles, So that'll be on all major corridors. And then after that funding or after those projects are complete, the rest of the money will go to community infrastructure, charging infrastructure. And it's on a community by community basis. A lot of it has to do with the electric cooperatives and whether they are interested in implementing this in their cooperative territories. So you'll see, if you look at charging maps, you'll see that some rural areas have a lot and some rural areas have none. And a lot of it is based on ownership of electric vehicles in that particular county. So the infrastructure has to come before the vehicles. There's a lot of new infrastructure that local governments can start looking at. There's new electric charging station that just goes onto an existing light pole. So things are getting simpler and easier to implement, and I do believe that it will happen in rural counties in the next few years.
Thank you.
You know, I must add one other question, and I hope I'm reading this correctly. These charts where you see all of these, the idling foci in the center of the state. So, you know, as we've been looking at some of the EJ issues, we have related a lot of the pollution to the far east. And that's not shown here.
Right, that's what I've noticed as well. So I'm wondering if we potentially should also look into if the data set includes all of the, like, for example, hog farm areas, the CAFO areas where there are more trucks there as well, and also what we were learning from today, like the landfill areas. I'm kind of making a note to look into that as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So the next item on the agenda is a follow-up to our action on cumulative impacts. You will remember that this came up, I think, about 2 meetings ago, and then we had a hearing session in our last meeting. And since that time, we have been working on a report. And Sherry, do you want to say anything about that?
Certainly. We are in the process of revising the recommendations. The report was pretty long. So we're trying to make it so that it will be more readable and it will be available soon.
Right. And actually, that was why I allowed this to go over a little the previous session, because I knew that we could make up the time here. And so hopefully we'll have that report for the next meeting. We're going to be working. And I must give Sherry credit. She's been working on it. She's done 2 documents, but we decided that, well, Sherry primarily worked on it, but it needs some more work, and we're going to sit down. We're going to get that together. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the EJEAB reflections on the Governor's Office community meeting that was recently held. And several of us either attended or zoomed in on it. So the one thing that I would like to say about that meeting that really refers to what we're doing, apparently there was a lot of discussion on what definition we would use for environmental justice. And as you know, we've been using the EPA definition, which many of us feel is fine, but it came up. So we're going to be looking into that. We have been presented with a questionnaire to give feedback on that issue as well as some other topics. So I'll let Sherry and Marilyn attend it as well.
I first of all want to thank EJ Can and Sherry for really getting the word out. I mean, there was some other people involved, but the meeting was here in Clinton, and I mean, I think you just did an extraordinary job getting people out and making sure that it was well attended. So that, just want to say thank you for that. And, thank you to the governor's office. They, seem very involved, Peter, in facilitating the meeting and so forth, along with the help from the MEC group. I thought that the meeting, overall went well. I felt that, the governor's office and the MEC group responded to, some of the community's concerns, and the community, I think there was gonna be an opportunity to kind of, have the public, session, public comment session, and then kind of break out afterwards. But I think the community felt like it would be good for everybody to just hear the comments. And so, they responded quickly, and, so we all just stayed in one session and listened, to each other. So I think, just having people feel free to adapt that way, and respond to that was good. I also think that, people were also told that they could, if they didn't feel comfortable getting up saying something, they could go to the facilitators, and I think that was also helpful. Thank you again, Sherry and team, and the governor's office for making sure that translation was available. That was just excellent to be able to hear from, our Spanish-speaking, friends, and they provided so much context to the meeting. Overall, I felt that it was pretty good. I think there was a little bit of confusion as to, what people may have been signing up for in the beginning and things like that, but we worked around that. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to participate and hear some of the comments, which, there were a lot around cumulative impacts and such, and so I felt like it was a good, session. Sherry.
I would like to say thanks to my staff, because if it had not been for the staff, it would not have been as successful as it was. But also thanks to the other partners who were part of making sure that we had good attendance. There were, probably about 100 people in the room, and then about 25 or so virtually, who joined, to participate. Very good comments across the board, as, Marilyn just said, cumulative impacts was, I would say, one of the priority areas that a number of the speakers addressed, and raised concerns about the fact that cumulative impacts were not being, had not been considered at this point, and it was imperative that be a consideration. There was not, the kind of tribal presence I would have liked to have seen, but I've since talked with my, co-chair, with Jeff Armstead, and we're gonna work on that to make sure that the next stakeholder meeting, which will be on the 22nd of May in Charlotte, on the 20th of May in Charlotte, will have representation or broader representation to address that concern. We don't have a time yet, I don't believe, but we do have the date scheduled for the 20th, working on a location in Charlotte for the next meeting. So I would encourage residents from that part of the state, because that will be the last meeting before there is the effort to develop the executive order. Has this gone into what we want to discuss?
The permanent separation.
Okay, any questions from the board, related to that meeting? Okay, so we'll go into the last, added agenda item that, Marilyn discussed.
Yes, I just want to provide space for, there's been a series of stakeholder meetings on the general permit. And I know Sherry's been attending that, just wanted to provide space, so that we can just talk about that, and, about that process and some of the community's feedback on that.
At this point, there've been 2 technical stakeholder meetings on the development of the new swine. Well, the permit will apply across the board to all of the ag operations, swine, poultry, and cattle. And this is the process of developing that new permit. There've been 2 by invitation only, technical stakeholder meetings. The next meeting coming up is May the 9th here in Clinton, and it is a public meeting for community members to be able to participate and share their concerns and experiences as this permit is being developed. That will be from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Tuesday the 9th here in Clinton at the Akron Civic Center. And we certainly should work very hard to get information out for the community to be able to participate before the draft permit is developed and then circulated again for some additional public comment period. There is an opportunity now, once the meeting is over on the 9th, to provide written comment back to DEQ by June 5th. So that is another opportunity that we, as a board, should certainly encourage be done for folks who would be interested in providing comments. So that, as you recall, when we submitted recommendations for the development of the biogas permit, the recommendations from the procedural recommendations from the board were adhered or accepted by DEQ, but the substantive recommendations were not taken into consideration, and so it is apparent that there needs to be something done to make sure that whatever the permit conditions are certainly protective of the communities that are going to be most adversely impacted. And I think you all saw some of that today.
Yeah, understood. And let me ask, since those recommendations would be given to DEQ, is that meeting announced on the DEQ website?
I'm sorry, the May 9th meeting?
Yes.
It is,
Okay.
yes, and it's been public noticed, and then I will flag that the recommendations you all made during the last process for 60 days of notice on the public meetings and 90 days for a comment period have already been built into the timeline for those public hearings coming in the fall.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, Sharon, will there be translation services at the meeting?
Yes, ma'am, I believe so.
Okay.
Very good. Any other questions or comments around this?
Can I just say
Of course.
one other
Yeah.
thing? And so just from talking to some community people, people from impacted communities on this issue, there is a concern that this is a check the box, I'm just being, right, a check the box exercise, and I'm hopeful that, that with the opportunity for input, next week, and then also the comments that will be received, that the agency, takes a very close look at those, and, because I kind of, sometimes when I hear the comments from the impacted community, I feel like that, you know, when people say that it's, you know, they feel like it's a check the box, that they don't feel like they're being heard. And I don't want them to get discouraged and not provide input into this process. And I, you know, I know that you all want to hear from people, but I'm hoping that we can, you know, continue to encourage the community to come out and respond to what they have to say.
I appreciate that. We absolutely, you know, have gone to great lengths to include a facilitator to restructure the stakeholder meetings. The one on Tuesday is set up in a drop-in style, so it is not simply, you know, kind of presenting 2 minutes of comments to staff. There are learning stations where you can provide information and gather information and sort of better understand the sections of the permit and the issues. And it's an opportunity for our staff to hear from the community. And so we absolutely, you know, would not go to this amount of effort to gather that input without considering it. So it's very important to both the leadership at DEQ and to the staff involved to hear from the communities as we move forward. I will say we are required to move forward with these renewals. It is part of the statutory process, the regulatory requirements. And so we are operating within those confines as well, but certainly are open to hearing all of that feedback before we move forward on the next steps.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Can I ask one last question, Sharon?
Yes, ma'am.
I had the opportunity to be in one of the technical stakeholder meetings. many of the community members will not understand the weeds like that, but it might be helpful for them to understand a little bit more, not just about the permitting process, but about the content of the permit. Will there be any opportunity, or will DEQ try to work a little bit more with community to make sure that if members of the community who would like to know more have the opportunity to learn more about the content of the permit, so that they would be better informed in giving comment or feedback to DEQ, either before the permit is drafted or after the permit is drafted and before the next comment period begins?
Absolutely, and so the way that the input session on Tuesday is structured is sort of to help understand the kind of sections of the permit in a much more approachable way than just copies of the permit themselves. And so certainly hope that's the case, but if you have other recommendations, we are certainly happy to, and we are always available if someone has specific questions to work directly with the community.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, as we are winding up, I want to give, first of all, I want to thank the city of Clinton for providing this facility for us. It's very nice, and so we're very grateful for that. And then the second thing I want to just briefly mention is, many of you might know that we had a toxic tour today. And I am very pleased to say that all of the board members here participated in that toxic tour. It was extremely revealing to all of us. It's one thing to read about issues that are harming the community and to hear from them, but when you go down there and you actually smell the stench, it really brings home what people are suffering. And on a lighter note, I spoke to a colleague this morning on my way to Clinton, and I said, I'm going to Clinton, North Carolina. You may not know where it is. And she says, oh, I do know. She said, I went to a wedding in Clinton 15 years ago. It was a beautiful wedding, but the stench was horrible. So this is what people have to live with. And I think it increased every member of the board's awareness of what's going on. And we're still looking at that, and we're trying to do everything we can to advise DEQ on what can be done to alleviate those harms. And I have one last thank you. This board is very fortunate to have Sherry White Williams on it. She arranged for the entire tour, and I don't know how we could have done that without having her right here on the board. And so I want to just publicly thank her for that. And I also want to thank, once again, DEQ staff for handling this meeting and allowing us to meet here. And Sharon, also for your responsiveness. Thank you very much. And with that, I don't want to forget anything. Yeah, if you have not signed up, I think everybody on this board has signed in, so I think that's it. We will take a break. Well, let me have a motion to adjourn first.
So we,
Second?
All in favor, let me say. Aye. Aye. Opposes? Okay, the meeting is adjourned, and remember, we will take a short break, and we'll have the public comment period beginning at 5:10 p.m. Thank you. We will now transition to the public comment. If people have signed up to speak, Ms. Poole will announce the names in the order in which the requests were received. We'll also announce who is on deck to comment. In order to accommodate all our speakers tonight, everyone will have 3 minutes to provide their comments. If audio is not working, please submit your comment in the chat or in writing. Please take note of the time remaining signs and stop when your time has come to a close. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Vice Chair Marianne. So we have 5 people who signed up for public comment, and the first person we have is Elaine Hunt.
Good afternoon. I want to come to show what we have at our house at 7171 Warstone Road. I've been going to the county for the past, I think 5 or 6 months, asking them to help us with this brown water. And they're telling me how expensive it would be, which I know it could be expensive, but I know there are grants and all available. And as I told them, we're not looking for handouts. We're just looking for helping hands. This brown water comes out of my kitchen faucet. This is my bathroom faucet. And as I told them, we can't wash white clothes because rusty water, the water, if you can see, this come out of my washing machine where you put your detergent, rusty. And we just want help. I realize the help I've been doing, I'm thankful for that. But we know what's on road need help also. I'm 4.5 miles from where the water has stopped. It stopped at Moultonville Road. And I'm 4.5 miles from that hill. So any help we can get, we should appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And next we have Ruby Bell Acock.
In 2 minutes, I thought she said 3, so I'm going. I'm Ruby Bell. I live here in, I live in Fayetteville, in Sampson County, near the Enviva Wood Pellet Facility. I am a member of the Impacted Communities Against Wood Pellets Coalition and serving as a community organizer. And I'm here today because I'm concerned about the environmental issues Enviva is causing in my community. The Enviva facilities, as all of you know, are located in Tier 1 communities, in Tier 1 counties, because we are among the lowest income counties with low environmental and health rankings. When I speak with the members of my community, they are very much concerned about Enviva. A lot of times they don't want to speak up because they feel like nothing will be done, even if they voice their opinions. The wood pellet production generates lots of fugitive dust, or what they call airborne particulate matter. Health problems associated with exposure to particulate matter involve damage to the lungs and the respiratory system. Here are a few of the concerns that I have received. I am concerned about the dust. My car is always covered with dust. I'm a cancer patient and I can't even sit outside. The dust comes over to my property and seeps into the groundwater. It doesn't make sense that you work all your life and then you can't live your life because people bring stuff around you, causing a bad environment. As a cancer survivor, I am concerned that the toxic gases can cause cancer even in small amounts. My father is dealing with a major health issue, and I do not want to complicate his illness with the dust issues. I can't sleep at night because of the noise. My biggest concern is the noise. I hear grinding and loud banging noises all the time. I can't sit on my screened-in porch because of the noise, and I have to sleep on the other side of my house. I am concerned about the trucks passing my house on a regular basis. I counted 5 trucks traveling Highway 403 in less than 30 minutes, and the trucks were uncovered with lots of debris flying off the truck. In January, these complaints were submitted to the Division of Air Quality at NCDEQ. Neither Enviva nor DEQ has addressed the concerns. We are asking and have asked Enviva to implement a fugitive dust control plan to reduce the amount of harmful dust, to limit the nighttime operations for the residents who live in that area, maybe from 10 to 7. and require that trucks entering and exiting the facility are fully covered. And also that Enviva will host listening sessions with the community members as they stated in a letter to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality on January 13, 2023, that was sent by the Executive Vice President of International Market Development and Public Affairs for their company, Enviva. I thank you so much for your time, and if there's anything that you can do to help us, we would certainly appreciate it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ruby. And next we have Lynn Hutchby, who might be joining in online. Is there a Lynn Hutchby joining in from online? And
She's unmuted.
Okay, yes, this is Lynn Hutchby, and I am very concerned about several issues. And I'm sure you are too. I mean, the legislature, for example, is not being transparent with the bills they write. Well, here we are again with another meeting with the DEQ, and I must say, I want to say give abundant support to your board. This is an amazing group of people who are working hard to listen to all of us. I'm in the mood of saying to the DEQ, however, that I'm not sure you want to hear public comment. It makes me question this because I had so much trouble getting through on previous permit calls. The people who are in impacted communities need to be able to access the method of getting to the public comment and getting signed up. And so the word waste is used in many ways. We say somebody wasted time. Well, does the DEQ think it's a waste of time to listen to impacted communities? Oh, or, you know, do the people who are trying to make public comment think it's a waste of time to try to get in because nobody's going to help them find a way to get in and do this? So there's multiple issues. Now, we have talked about hog waste, poultry waste, and we're saying health. We also use the term somebody got wasted. So you know that if someone's health is wasting away because of the poison that's being spewed from hog waste, poultry waste, CAFOs in general, the poison that DEQ is expected to prevent is in question. So I wanted to thank you again for allowing me to make public comment and to let you know that for those of you who are responsible for the technology here, please ask your grandmother to try it out first before you, put it out for the rest of the public, because this is all of us, regardless of our ages, need to be able to get into this kind of meeting and make a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Next, we have Will Hendrick.
Good evening. My name is Will Hendrick, and I'm the Environmental Justice Director for the North Carolina Conservation Network. I want to begin by echoing thanks for your service and your genuine commitment to environmental justice. I'm convinced that if you were making decisions for this agency, there would be less room for it. However, you do not make those decisions, but you do occupy an important role in the decision-making of this agency. And I am here to urge you to exercise that role. The advice regarding terms, substantive, by which swine operations will be regulated, both in the context of the swine waste management general permit and the swine digestive general permit. These are for the multiple members of the board who teach environmental justice courses, textbook environmental justice concerns. I specifically wish that you would issue an official advisory statement. After all, that is according to your operating procedures as adopted in November 2020, one of the 4 types of official actions that you can take. I also want to acknowledge and thank you for taking one of those types of actions by adding an agenda item today. But discussion is not the same as collective action. And that collective action and voice that you have as a body is important to weigh in on this particular issue because of its discriminatory impact. I regret also that you can't respond to what I say today because you've already voted to adjourn. Would encourage you not to adjourn before public comment in the future so that in theory you could act in response to it. I also regret that you don't have a regularly scheduled quarterly meeting before the agency has already announced its plans to draft the permits in question. So I don't know if you have a chance, absent calling a special meeting, to weigh in, for instance, again on the process, and I would encourage you to do so because that's the only recommendations to which the Secretary responded in 2021 when you were commenting on the development of the current digester general permit. In that context, if you were to make procedural recommendations, I would emphasize the importance of tribal consultation because of the impacts of these operations, specifically on the Kahari, in whose tribal lands we sit today, the Lumbee, the Waccamaw-Siouan, and Meherrin, among other tribal interests impacted by these operations. But substantively, and perhaps more importantly, I encourage you to advise the consideration and response to cumulative impacts in communities hosting these permitted operations. You may be aware, for instance, that there was a Title VI complaint recently filed against DEQ alleging its inability to do that because it completely ignores the impacts of dry litter poultry operations. But there is ample time for this agency to determine what it's going to do about the cumulative impacts borne by communities hosting CAFOs, because these permits don't expire until next September. The applications won't even come in until next April. And, as you know, you've recently voted to adopt recommendations regarding the consideration of cumulative impacts. I hope that they are submitted, I hope that there is a response to them, and I hope that that response comes in the form of substantive provisions in these general permits. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. And lastly, we have Ana Flores Dovo.
So I was told I had 3 minutes, so I'm gonna take 3 minutes. All right, so the UN made access to water, safe water, a human right in 2010. That was 13 years ago. In 2021, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services estimated that 2.4 million North Carolina residents rely on groundwater as their primary drinking water. An NRDC report found that race was the biggest determinant of water quality, and there is no better testament to that than the community of Lakewood School Road here in Sampson County. They are surrounded by county water all around them except the predominantly black street. The same community that fought the state's largest landfill 40 to 50 years ago. North Carolina has the 3rd highest rate for PFAS in the country, which includes Sampson County. Sampson County, that is already overburdened by the CAFO industry, the 2nd largest methane emitting landfill in the country, Smithfield, and Enviva. Cumberland County is included in those 11 counties, and Cumberland County that hosts one of the largest, if not the largest, military bases in the world. Families that are already dealing, I get emotional because my husband is in the military, but anyway, so if I cry, that's why. But families that are already dealing with so much insecurity, like mine, veterans, young military couples with children, and civilians who, although they don't serve their countries in the same way, they all deserve a right to safe drinking water, per the UN. Yet here we find ourselves day in and day out pleading state agencies to do their jobs because they have prioritized industry over people's livelihoods, and they continue to do so constantly. We community organizers are asked to organize community members to show up to listening sessions, community input meetings, just to see no positive changes happen. Boards are created to appease the public, yet they have no real power because they make recommendations and none are put into effect. Last year, I went to the Kenmore's open house, and I am Hispanic, my family speaks Spanish, so I raised concerns about language accessibility on their website. And one of their staff members told me that I should look at the website and I should send them any recommendations for documents that should be translated into Spanish. Take a look at Camp Lejeune. Bragg is not too far from that. My husband and I often joke that we will see commercials stating, "You may be entitled to compensation if you were stationed at Fort Bragg during insert time here." And although we joke, that is the reality that we are facing. And I will leave that there, but NCDQ, all state agencies need to start working for the people and not for industry.
Thank you very much, Anna. And those are all of the public comments that we had for at least the signups that we had for public comments. So I turn it back over to you, Vice Chair Marion.
Well, we have already closed the meeting. The meeting has been adjourned, and I will close this session. Thank you.